All right, welcome to the John David Ebert School for the Study of Culture, Cosmology, and the Arts, an adventure in consciousness. That alludes, of course, to Alfred North Whitehead's Adventures of Ideas, and also the book by Sat Prem that introduces Sri Aurobindo, or the Adventure of Consciousness. And I've chosen as the banner head for the page, which is not yet available yet. I'm still working on the website here, going through Teachable. This is a scene from the Ramayana. I did not want a cliched Western dead white men image, like, say, the Vitruvian Man of Leonardo, or something like that. I definitely wanted to connote that this is a global study that we'll be undertaking. We'll be looking at works of art, literature, philosophy, and so forth from all over the world. And this is from the Ramayana, one of my favorite books. The battle between the monkeys and the demons who have abducted, Ravana has abducted Sita, the wife of the hero Rama, and he has hominid allies, monkeys, who come in and help with that. So this sort of attempt to stabilize the astral plane by expelling the demons from it, invoking hominid consciousness. So I will do a course at some point on the Ramayana. So for my inaugural class here, this is a class on the study of the evolution of consciousness. I've called it Transformations of Consciousness Through Time. And in this course, we will be looking at the works of 6 great thinkers. Firstly, Rudolf Steiner, and here is the Amazon page for the primary book that we'll be looking at, An Outline of Esoteric Science, which was published in 1910, and which really does more or less kick off the study of the evolution of consciousness as it has evolved over time. And this is pretty much Steiner's masterwork, kind of his equivalent to a Bible, let's say. And it has, 7 chapters. Steiner loves 7s. The character of esoteric science, the makeup of the human being, and that will involve the discussion of his model of the subtle body, the physical body, the etheric body, the astral body, and the ego, sleep and death, and then his cosmic evolution in the human being, where he goes through his various stages of the cosmos, the Saturn phase, the Sun phase, the Moon phase, the Earth phase, then down to Atlantis, and then the great civilizations. So this is the first book that we'll look at. It is not necessary that you read the entire book. The course is simply intended to stimulate further study should you decide to read the book. And so the course will be composed of 8 classes that will begin on May 14th, Saturday, May 14th at noon, Mountain Standard Time. Each class will have a video, and this is the video, both the promo and the video for the first class, which will be just simply orientation and the students getting to know each other for 2 hours, noon to 2 p.m. on May 14th. And then we'll look at, of course, Sri Aurobindo, The Life Divine, which is a masterpiece that he wrote that was serialized in the publication known as Area between 1914 and 1919. Although the book wasn't published as a whole until, I think, 1939. And it's a masterpiece, and it's absolutely huge. But Sat Prem's book is short and readable on Aurobindo, Sri Aurobindo, or An Adventure in Consciousness. So there's lots of stuff here, but lots of chapters on all different kinds of aspects of the involution and then evolution of consciousness, as the Brahman involutes itself and involves itself in matter, and then gradually unfolds through the history of evolution and the evolution of human consciousness to come to know itself, sort of like Hegel in a certain way. But this is, of course, Aurobindo drawing on the great Hindu tradition and synthesizing it with Western science to produce a masterpiece. And his main idea is the supramental, the descent of the supramental, which, as we'll see, is equivalent to, in a certain respect, it's equivalent to Jean Gebser's book, which we'll also read in the Ever-Present Origin, equivalent to his idea of integral consciousness. But I don't think they're the same thing, despite Gebser saying that they are. But the whole point of the course is to sort of have fun debating these ideas and analyzing them, and getting people excited about them. So then we'll move on to Teilhard de Chardin's The Phenomenon of Man, which came out in 1955, and he was a Catholic priest, and we'll look at his model of the movement of the cosmos from cosmogenesis to geogenesis, to biogenesis, and then ultimately to new genesis in the sense of nous, mind. The human mind is a total mutation, and it's gradually evolving towards an omega point and also the Christification of matter, as he calls it. So you can see the layout here. Book 1, Before Life Came, Cosmogenesis and Geogenesis. Then Book 2, Life, the Biogenesis. And then Book 3, Thought, New Genesis, as in nous. So that's Teilhard de Chardin. And then we'll also look at, from a Jungian perspective, Erich Neumann's book, The Origins and History of Consciousness, which came out in 1949, the same year as Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. And both books are very similar. But I think that in Neumann's case, he's really talking about stages in the evolution of consciousness, both in human macro consciousness, historical consciousness, as well as in the individual development, let's say ontogeny, recapitulating phylogeny. So he's got the mythological stages here first, with the creation myth, the Ouroboros, the Great Mother, then the separation of the world parents, which we find in what Jean Gebser calls the mythical consciousness structure as it evolves first in Mesopotamia and then in Egypt. And both of those civilizations feature the myth of the separation of the world parents as it moves from the magical consciousness into the mythical consciousness structure. And then he has the hero myth too, the birth of the hero, the slaying of the mother, the slaying of the father. In Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, he has these inverted. He starts with the hero myth and goes through his idea of what he calls the monomyth, which is a term he has taken from Joyce's Finnegan's Wake to describe how the hero, any hero, undertakes a journey by separating from the known horizon, separation, initiation, undergoing trials, torments, ordeals, and overcoming them, and then return back home with the boon that will transform the wasteland of society that has been left behind. Then he talks about, in the second half of the book, the cosmogonic myth, the creation myth, the transformation of the universe, and also the transformations of daily consciousness as discussed in the Upanishads, moving from deep dreamless sleep to dreaming consciousness, and then to waking consciousness, and then back again. And then we have the transformation myth here. Then he has the ontogenetic aspect of this with the psychological stages in the development of personality, the original primary unity of the child's consciousness, then moving toward the separation of the systems. And he has this idea of centroversion, the balancing of the waking the waking mind, the conscious mind, and the unconscious mind, as well as the balancing of extroversion and introversion, hence centroversion. Jung had said that most individuals are either extroverts or introverts, and that generally is pretty true and pretty obvious. But centroversion is one of Neumann's main ideas. Then we have the balance and crisis of consciousness, and then we have centroversion and the stages of life, and the group and the individual. So we'll look at that. This is a very fun book, very exciting. And then of course we will look at, you can't do a course on the evolution of consciousness without Jean Gebser. It's just not possible. You can omit other people, but not Jean Gebser. The Ever-Present Origin was published in 1949. And let's take a look here at the title page. And it was in 2 volumes. Let's see, it's missing the Part 1, Foundations of the Aperspectival World, a contribution to the history of the awakening of consciousness. And then Part 2, Manifestations of the Aperspectival World, an attempt at the concretion of the spiritual. And then the first volume has to do with laying the foundations insofar as he talks about the different stages of consciousness that have been gone throughout human history. First, the archaic consciousness, which is generally, he doesn't say much about it, it's generally characteristic of, it's sort of like Neumann's Ouroboros consciousness. It's completely unified, nothing differentiated yet. The hominid consciousness, let's say, even before the Paleolithic. Then with the Paleolithic comes in the magical consciousness structure, where the world begins to become known as a single point-like unity. So the pars pro toto, the part for the whole, rules magic. If you want power over someone, you have to get their hidden name, let's say, or a piece of their hair. Sort of like in voodoo, which is a degeneration of it from Gebser's point of view into black magic. That's the magical consciousness structure, and it's pretty characteristic of the Paleolithic and tribal man generally, and goes down to and overlaps with the Neolithic. When with the mother goddess cults that come in with the discovery of agriculture, we start seeing the shift into the mythical consciousness structure with the Great Mother. This is the phase that Neumann talks about as the Great Mother in his book. And then the full phase of the mythical consciousness structure comes in with Mesopotamia, 3500 BC, and with ancient Egypt, about 2900 BC. And that's when we get the myth of the separation of the world parents, so that the macro soul, let's say in India, Brahman, and the micro soul, Atman, are now separated. The world is no longer a point like magical unity where lines of mysterious magic connect everything to everything else. Now there's beginning to be a differentiation of consciousness into a kind of Tao-like image of yin-yang. Light, dark. The light contains the dark, and the dark contains the light. Then eventually this moves into what he calls the mental consciousness structure, which comes in with what Toynbee calls the second generation of civilization. The first generation corresponding to Gebser's mythical consciousness structure. The second generation starts coming in, and we start getting, across the board, philosophically oriented civilizations. Philosophy does not exist in ancient Sumer or in Egypt. They never attained that level. But it comes in with the Greeks and the pre-Socratics in the West, and in the Old Testament with the Hebrews, which is, though it's religious, it is also fundamentally philosophical. It is a philosophy, a way of looking at the world. Ecclesiastic is a perfect example of it. And then, of course, in India with the Upanishads and the introduction there of philosophical thinking and the transformations through Jainism and Sankhya and Buddhism, and then eventually Vedanta, which is the end phase of the transformations of philosophy in India, and then, of course, in China with the 100 schools, not much of which has survived due to the book burnings. We have, of course, Lao Tzu, Confucius, Mozu, Chuang-Tzu, and a few others, but there's not many. But this is the mental consciousness structure, the first phase of it. The second phase of it comes in with the Renaissance and the shift into perspectival space with the discovery of depth perspective in painting, starting with Masaccio around the 1430s, and then finally gets perfected by Leonardo right around the year 1500. So now it's the late phase of the mental consciousness structure, the perspectival phase of it, where the world is seen as a three-dimensional entity with a vanishing point. And then you get down to a perspectival period, which is modernism, which starts with Impressionist art in the 1860s. Manet really is the first to begin breaking up perspectival space, and then we're on the way to Cubism. And Cubism is aperspectival. It takes up multiple spaces, multiple temporalities simultaneously, and unites them to create a hyperdimensional object. Whether it's a landscape or a portrait or whatever it is, it's the hyperdimensional object. That's my word, not Gebser's, but that's basically what he's doing, is mapping it out. And we get mythological archetypes, Jungian archetypes start coming in as well during this, and he calls this consciousness not just aperspectival, but integral, because it takes the previous levels of consciousness, which have continued to be ever present. A new consciousness structure does not nullify the previous one. It takes it and includes it, takes up, transcends, and includes, to use Ken Wilber's terminology, the previous structures holonomically, let's say. So if we could imagine all of these consciousness structures as a holon, as holes within holes within holes, that's what it is. It's integral. So the magical consciousness structure can be activated, as it is in occult and supernatural phenomena. Horror fiction and movies map all that out with the magical consciousness structure. The mythical consciousness structure can be activated. That's also mapped out with movies like the Star Wars films or Wagnerian opera, let's say. And then the mental consciousness structure would correspond to something like science fiction in its mythological aspect. Science fiction is the mythology of science. And by the way, I do want to do a course at one point on the evolution of science fiction, where we'll read through all the great science fiction novels from Wells and Verne down to I don't know, let's say William Gibson or Neil Stevenson. So that's book one, and then book two, Manifestations of the Aperspectival World, where he basically sees modernity as a new consciousness structure that's fundamentally, it's intellectual, but it's spiritual. It transcends, it's not irrational, it's arational. So it transcends all of those distinctions. Okay, so we'll look at Gebser, and then we will end the course with Arthur Young, The Reflexive Universe. One of my favorite books on the evolution of consciousness. Arthur Young was an engineer back in the 1950s who perfected the Bell helicopter that you see at the beginning of every episode of MASH. That's his design in his helicopter. So he's an engineer, and he brings an engineer's mentality into this field, sort of inherits the tradition of the phenomenon of man, where he goes through all these different geneses from matter to life to mind, as Aurobindo does, and then Aurobindo takes it to the supramental, just as Gebser takes it to the integral. So he sees, he's unique in the sense that he has the most concrete knowledge of science, I think, other than maybe Chardin, out of all of these guys. So he sees the fall and light as purposive. So his whole view is that light falls into matter and is captured in matter, and it goes through transformations of consciousness, first with plants, whereby it regains its initial full freedom. The plant has 1 degree of freedom, then it moves into the animal, which has 2 degrees of freedom. The plant can only grow vertically, so it's 1 degree of freedom that it retains, or regains rather, from the original 4 degrees of freedom of light. And then the animal consciousness comes along, and it's 2 degrees of freedom that it now has, since it can move about in a 360 degree radius through space. And then the human being comes in and liberates through higher human consciousness the original freedom of light. I think it's 3 degrees of freedom, and that it started with and then gradually lost as it went down through subatomic matter, then atoms, then molecules. The molecular world is the sort of nadir of the fall of light into matter, which is then eventually liberated by human consciousness. So we have the fall, and we can see some of the chapters here, the 4 levels. He goes through all of these in a very intricate but elegant way. Young was a master of concision. He doesn't go on and on and on, like, say, Aurobindo does. It takes Aurobindo forever to make his points. He makes his points very quickly and succinctly. This is not a difficult book to read. He goes through molecules, plants, animals, atoms, nuclear particles, light, goes through all those, the turn, which is the descent to the level of molecules, and then the turn is the beginning of life. When life, the first bacteria start coming along, and so atoms, the molecular kingdom, he goes through and gives all these stages and analyses, the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and finally, evolution is applied to man. In a certain way, Rudolf Steiner had done this too with his idea that the model of the subtle body sort of incorporates all of this in the human body, insofar as the physical body corresponds to the mineralogical world, whereas the etheric body corresponds to the plant world. Anything that's alive has an etheric body. The etheric body is a kind of slumberous, dreamlike consciousness that confers on plants their ability to live and be alive in an instinctive sort of sleeping consciousness fashion, let's say. And the etheric body is what, of course, organizes our physical form, and it can be manipulated with things like acupuncture. The meridians are part of it, as are the chakras in the human subtle anatomy. And then the animal has something that plants don't have, namely an astral body. And the astral body confers waking consciousness now on the animal. So you can see the homologs here between Arthur Young's idea of the plant retaining 1 degree of freedom in that it can grow vertically, and the animal 2 degrees of freedom, regaining rather, in that it can move about in a 360 degree radius. So you can. This is why I wanted to do this course, so we can look at their models and compare these guys. And then with human consciousness, humans have something that animals don't have, namely an ego. In other words, self-conscious, self-reflexive awareness. For Steiner, that's what the ego is, and the human being as the only being in the world that knows that it is awake, perceptive, and aware, and can therefore introspectively analyze that, and then can also activate higher powers to access knowledge of the spiritual worlds. So that's the outline of the course. That's what we'll be looking at over the course of 8 classes, an introductory class, which this will be the video for, and there'll be a different video for each class that the student will have ideally at least watched, plus some readings. Then we'll attend class for 2 hours from noon to 2, and we'll have discussions of the readings. I'll give like a 20-minute opening talk to kick things off for each class, and then we'll just dig into it and have fun. So the homepage is not yet up, but it will be soon for the John David Ebert School for the Study of Culture, Cosmology, and the Arts. So watch for it. And as soon as it's up, I will put the link in and probably also make another promo video for it. But it should be up soon. If you're interested right now, and you know you're going to have a block of eight Saturdays available from the middle of May there through June and the middle of July, you can hit me up at my email, which is johndavidebert@gmail.com, and you can inquire about the prices there, which I'm still working out. I pretty much know what the prices are going to be, but I haven't set the model up yet. So getting there. All right, then. That's it. Hope to see you online for a discussion of the philosophy of the evolution of consciousness.